like a
Okay.
mission launch.
Benji, you will accelerate with your car when we launch the countdown. You'll see that. You will reach 200.
I've already been there now, like approaching Stuttgart, so there's usually a lot of traffic.
EV traffic. We're okay. All we're live on YouTube.
Hey guys.
Good morning.
Alex? Okay, once again, welcome everyone. It's time for our first public event of ISP. So I will hand over to the ISU president at this point. Juan, if you can hear me, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and greetings from planet Earth. My name is Juan de Dalmau, and I'm speaking to you from the central campus of the International Space University in Strasbourg, France, very close to Germany. I would like to welcome the crew members of this interactive space program, and also all our guests, because this is a public lecture, as Commander Göktuğ just said, that is open to anyone there interested in a topic that may sound a little cold if you read the title of this lecture, Policy Rationales for Space Activities. It may sound cold, but in reality, it is a very hot topic. And our distinguished speaker will demonstrate to you that this is indeed a very hot topic. Space policy, it remains a hot topic. I'm very honored to introduce to you Professor John LOGSDON, who is the founder of the George Washington University's Space Policy Institute. I believe this policy institute could be renamed now as the John LOGSDON Institute, but this is probably a topic for another session. John has trained many international space policy professionals, obviously many of them from the United States. For example, one of the NASA deputy administrators, Laurie Garver, was John's student, but also the head of international affairs at the German DLR space agency, Nicola Peter. Other famous space policy experts like Peter Marcus at the US government, the White House Director for Space Policy, but also top managers in the private world. For example, Stephanie Bednarek, who is today Director of Commercial Sales at SpaceX, or Dan Hendrickson, who is Vice President at Astrobotics, a company that was recently selected by NASA to provide space transportation services to the moon. But let me mention one more student of John LOGSDON's. And this person was, because he's no longer alive, Todd Hawley. For those of you who were present earlier today in the introduction that Captain Göktuğ gave to you about the history and the origins of ISU, you will remember the name of Todd Hawley as one of the three founders. So John, thank you for inspiring and for teaching Todd, because without that, we would probably not be here today. John, you have served on many different projects. One of them was the Space Shuttle Columbia Accident Investigation Board in 2003. You have also been a strong supporter of many students who from your university then went on to take different courses at the International Space University, and your institute even provided funding for some of them. Obviously, as a professor, you have written books, but in your case, I'm losing count, but you have published and edited hundreds of publications, and many books bear your name, especially on the Apollo program and the US space history. When someone needs to consult with an expert on United States space policy, no matter from which country, they come to you. You are the first go-to person. When we look at your collaboration with ISU, we have seen you as an elected member of the Academic Council, and today you are serving as a member of the Committee for Academic Review and Evaluations. For us, your lecture today, John, is very special because you have decided to step down from being an active member of the ISU faculty. We're happy that we can still call you, we can still send you an email. And I believe that on your first slide, we will see your email address. So I would like everyone to really take note of your email because you have been kind enough to accept that we can send you questions or consult with you. Thank you so much, John. The floor is yours.
Okay, I guess I'm unmuted. Thank you, Juan, for that gracious introduction.
We hear you well.
Indeed, I have been involved with ISU since before it existed. I've seen Todd's notebooks when he was a student sketching out the concept for a space-related, space-focused university. I was at the founding conference, and I've taught and participated in almost every summer program since the first one in 1988. So it's a little melancholy that this will be my final formal lecture with ISU, but it's time to step aside and let the next couple of generations. So let me get started. One of my issues at my point in life is I'm not a great expert on IT and social media. So I'm going to try to bring up my presentation now. Let's see. It says share screen, and it does not show my computer. All right, so where am I going to go to get to my computer? Or if I could get my helper Rishi to pull up the presentation, maybe that would work. That's not going to work.
Now we can see your screen, John.
Yeah, but it's the wrong thing.
So if you click on share screen, it should show you the different screens that you can present.
Right, it does that, and I do not have my computer screen there.
Okay, I can share mine if you'd like, and then
would you do that, please,
yeah,
Rishi?
Sure.
And then start the slideshow.
No problem.
And I apologize to everybody for this glitch. All right, let's go back to the start.
Sorry, 1 second. Bear with me. Just have to present it.
Well, let's see. Are you on slideshow view?
Yes, you should be able to see that. Can anyone not see? Can you not see it, John?
We see
I can
slide
see
number
it, but
9.
it's 3 or 4 slides in. 9
Right, sorry.
slides in.
Sorry about that. Okay, there we go.
There we go. All right, I may have to ask you to advance the slide.
No problem.
So that's the email address.
Yes, there's my email address. That's a nice image of ISU's main headquarters for those that are not familiar. All right, let's go to the next slide. And in fact, go to the one after that. I mean, this discussion addresses a pretty basic question. Why are we humans on this particular planet doing things in space? I mean, it's not easy. It's still expensive. It's gotten less expensive, but it's still expensive. There's still accidents. Things don't always work. And both technically and managerially, it's hard to do. So why do it? Well, for the private sector, for most people in the private sector, the idea is to create a business that returns a profit so that the business can continue. That's, in a sense, what the private sector is about. There are a few very wealthy individuals, people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Richard Branson, Yuri Milner come to mind, who have a vision of space that's personal to them. But for governments, the governments are established to serve the interests of their citizens, of their population. And so the reason that governments have chosen to go into space is basically to serve a variety of national and public interests. And it's talking about that variety of interests that is the core of this lecture. So next slide. There's a Paris-based company called Euroconsult that does these very interesting graphics depicting various aspects of the space program. I would not take the numbers on this slide as gospel truth, as fact, but they're not, in our current terms, they're not fake news either. At least it gives you a sense of proportion of how much various governments spend on both civilian and national security space. And if you see in small print in the bottom left, in the size of the United States circle on this chart is even undersized. It's 80% of the reality. So if you added up all these numbers, you'd find that the United States spends more on space, the United States government spends more on space than all the rest of the world combined. So I've kind of been accused in the past of a US-centric approach in this discussion. But the reality is that the United States at least spends more money on space than the rest of the world combined. I think you can find your own country there. It is now interesting. I think that as a single country, China spends more on space than any other country except the United States. The European Space Agency and the European Union combined are probably second in spending. And the other numbers you can see and examine it at your leisure. Let's go to the next slide. Juan says policy is dull. Well, to those of us that have made their career dealing with policies, it's not very dull. But there's some misunderstanding of what policy means. First of all, a goal is not a policy. A goal, a rationale, a purpose is why you're doing something. In this case, why a government wants to carry out space activity. And I've given a couple examples of rationales, of goals. Knowledge, power, benefits, helping the private sector. A policy is what you do to achieve the goal, a path of action to be pursued to achieve a particular rationale, goal, or purpose. And I've given some examples of policy there. So we're talking mainly in this discussion about rationales, not policies. And one of the things you ought to be able to do when you look at a particular space activity is understand why it's been done or being done. You know, what is its rationale? I put together a list. This is my list. Others would probably have a slightly different list. Go to the next slide. A variety of rationales for government space activities. You can scan this list quickly. I'm going to talk about each of them separately. But these are the wide variety of purposes, of rationales, of goals that drive government space activities. And as you can see, they are very different one from another. The next slide. I'm going to start kind of historically. The the first reason that governments decided to send spacecraft into orbit and beyond, satellites in orbit, spacecraft beyond, is because the scientific community in particular countries in then the Soviet Union, now Russia, in the United States and in Europe said, hey, if we could put our instruments into outer space, we could get some data that would enable us to answer important scientific questions. Those of you that are listening that are scientists know that what you want most is new data, because new data drives the answers to the questions that you're researching. In the now 63 years that we've been putting things in space, we really have revolutionized the understanding both of our local neighborhood, our solar system, and the universe beyond, up to the point of doing Nobel Prize quality research. This image from Hubble, I think, is fascinating because there was a decision to point Hubble at one place in space to look at some nearby galaxies and leave it on for a time exposure. And what the investigators discovered was there were literally thousands of galaxies within the cosmos in that one small patch. And the implication being it'd be the same thing beyond. A lot of the space science projects in recent years have gotten very expensive. Probably the most expensive now is the James Webb Space Telescope, waiting for launch now at the end of next year. We seem like we've been waiting for the Webb Telescope forever, which is an $8 to $10 billion mission. Hubble itself is an extremely expensive mission. Are governments going to be willing to continue to pay that kind of money, I think is an important question. And if not, can we use faster, better, cheaper, smaller satellites and spacecraft? How much science can CubeSats, nanosats, which I see is spelled wrong, to do that? I'm throwing a few questions as I go along for you to think about. I'm not going to try to answer them. But as we move towards smaller satellites, does it mean we can do less science? I think it's an interesting question. Next slide. Along with gathering new data, we're going new places and seeing new things. To me, one of the humanistic reasons for going into space is just to explore, to go, travel, see new places, discover new things, not so much because of their scientific importance, but just because we've never seen them before. I mean, here's an image taken by the New Horizons spacecraft a couple of years ago of Pluto's moon, Charon, which is probably a captured asteroid or another planetoid because it's almost the same size. Who knew what it looked like before New Horizons took this image? And we've now sent robotic spacecraft to every planet, to comets, asteroids, the moons of some planets. And we have had a few spacecraft leave the solar system, particularly Pioneer and Voyager spacecraft from the 70s. We have sent 12 humans to walk on another celestial body between 1969, between today, 51 years ago, Armstrong and Aldrin left the moon after Apollo 11's historic mission. From 69 to 72, 12 people walked on the moon's surface, none since, and no person has traveled beyond Earth orbit since. We have not explored ourselves. And I'll come back to that at the end. And we've looked out into the universe in ways, in different wavelengths. You'll get a discussion quickly about the frequency spectrum. We've looked in almost all aspects of the spectrum out into the universe. And we've discovered a lot of interesting things. So that exploration imperative, I think, is one of the reasons the public wants governments to continue to be active in space. What is it, another day or two, China will send its first mission to land on Mars. The United Arab Emirates has just sent its first planetary mission to orbit Mars. So this is something I think we're going to continue to do. Next slide. Certainly the idea that being able to operate in space is an indication of the prestige, the power of the capabilities of a country has been an important element in driving space activity. It was the Soviet Union with Sputnik in 1957, and then Sputnik 2 with a dog on board a few months later, landing on the moon, hard landing in 1959, then Yuri Gagarin, first orbital flight in 1961, that claimed that those achievements indicated the superiority of the Soviet society. The United States, locked in a Cold War bipolar competition for global leadership with the Soviet Union, President John Kennedy said, that's not acceptable. We will show that we're better in space than the Soviet Union. And how to do that? He asked his advisors, and the advisors came back and said, send people to the moon. That was the genesis of the Apollo project. He asked, find me a space program which promises dramatic results in which we could win. And Apollo was the answer. Now other countries are using their space accomplishments to enhance national image. I'm often asked, is there going to be another space race, particularly between the United States and China? And my answer to that is no, because a race has a finish line. And I don't think there are finish lines remaining, except maybe the first humans on Mars. I think there is going to be a global mixture of cooperation and competition in space in the 21st century, but nothing like the US Soviet race to the moon in the 1960s. In fact, I think the way you get prestige and indicate leadership, indicate power these days is leading in cooperative undertakings. And both the United States and China, with its soon to be launched space station, are offering the opportunities to cooperate. Can you lead if you don't have human spaceflight? Is there a special role for humans in indicating power and prestige and leadership? Question we can come back to later. Next slide. Along with prestige and leadership is a rather more specific thing, which is knowing what's going on outside your borders. And once it was discovered by national leadership, particularly in this case by the United States, that by launching satellites and gathering information about what's going on behind the Iron Curtain in the Cold War in the 50s, that this was something that countries should do. And so the United States pioneered in what we would call colloquially spy satellites. And we've come a long way and still are launching national security satellites to get a variety of information with photographic imagery, radars, signals collection, even other forms of intelligence. So a number of governments now own and operate national security satellites. I've listed some. Those same satellites have been employed to monitor arms control treaties and are important to seeing what's going on in the world, understanding what's going on in the world, so that national leaders don't do things rashly, but can be aware of threats to national security and even homeland security. And again, we could talk a long time about the various ways that these systems are used. My point here is from the start, it was an important reason that governments were active in space. Now we can buy imagery that of a high resolution Earth observation, 24/7 daily images of what's going on in the world. That kind of information used to only be available to national leaders. What are the implications of global transparency for global stability and managing this spaceship that we're living on? Next slide. Also, from the very start, those involved in developing military capabilities for a particular country, in this case, again, first the United States, then the Soviet Union, now many other countries, have recognized that space capabilities can support warfighting activities by providing secure communications, by predicting the weather, by giving early warning, by providing navigation, positioning, fixing, timing. The global positioning satellite was started and still is managed by our military in the United States, and it had security, military purposes in its origin. Finding your targets, identifying them, being aware of what's happening, and just knowing what's going on in space, whether there are threats to your satellites from either ground-based or space-based activities. All of those are space support to the military warfighter. They have not delivered force on a target. There have not been the use of space systems to attack anything else yet. The United States has led the way and that's why our budget is so large, by the way, is what we have a national security space budget in the United States that's larger than the civilian budget. And it creates some vulnerabilities because if you satellites in orbit have to follow the laws of physics, and they're a little more vulnerable than than many other military targets, and that raises some issues. Let me go to the next slide. Talk to a couple of those issues. I claim, there are people that disagree with me on this, by the way, that space has so far been a sanctuary without direct military conflict. There haven't been wars where spacecraft are fighting other spacecraft. That runs counter to historical experience in the land, the water, and air. When we learned to operate there, we began to fight there. How long can space become a sanctuary if it still is? Are there already weapons there? How do you define a weapon is a very tricky business. I mentioned global positioning satellites. They're used to guide precision weapons to their targets. So they're, in a sense, a gun sight. That make them part of a weapon system? Not an easy question to answer. Can there be agreements to keep space weapons free? There's been a lot of discussion of the prevention of an arms race in outer space, either by treaty or by diplomacy, non-treaty diplomacy, or by threats that if you attack us, we'll attack you in space. I suspect I'll get some questions about the implications of the United States recently creating a space force. What is that all about? Is that stormtroopers in space? Are we getting to a Star Wars kind of environment or not? I think not, by the way. I think it's the US Space Force to date is mainly a bureaucratic maneuver by those who think that the pilots in the Air Force have not given enough attention to space and so want their own organization to operate all these space systems that we already have. But we can come back to that. Next slide. space has become crowded, it's become competitive, it's become conflictual. And so there's an increasing interest as more and more countries get active in space, make sure that space is secure, is able to be used by everybody who wants to use it for peaceful purposes, hopefully. We can't get the benefits of space if we can't use it, if orbits are so cluttered by debris that they become unusable, or if there's threat of military action that could interfere with civilian activities. How do you do that? It's a very interesting question. I'm sure you will address during your summer your program. I say this summer, it's not summer to everybody that's listening. Do you negotiate treaties like the treaties that Russia and China has suggested on preventing an arms race? Do you try to get voluntary codes of conduct or rules of good behavior, which is the approach the United States has been suggesting? Or do you depend on individual countries acting in the common interest by some shared norms of good behavior? We've done that with avoiding the creation of new space debris. There are a set of voluntary measures in place to do that. The next steps, I think, are creating some sort of system for knowing what's going on in space, where it is, what it's doing. This is called space situational awareness. Who does that? I mean, the military is interested because that allows them to identify potential targets and potential threats. But there's a lot of civilian interest. The operators of communication satellites have a voluntary organization that does this sort of situational awareness. And there's a growing international discussion of who carries on. Once you recognize how crowded space can be in certain orbits in space, you need to think of the space equivalent of air traffic control. Now, there's some pitfalls in using that analogy, but it's useful. Who does that? Who says you can launch to a particular orbit at a particular time? There is no no international authority for doing traffic management. Should there be? Must there be? How can there be? All good questions. Those are policy questions, by the way. Next slide. Clearly, space provides benefits for society. Your work this summer on the contributions of space capabilities to managing the current pandemic, I think is a perfect example of the kind of benefits that space capability can provide for society. These images are from the Copernicus Sentinel satellites looking at Italy and showing the difference between last year and this year after the shutdown in the generation of nitrous dioxide, a kind of nasty chemical into the atmosphere. So it shows the sort of things that could be done. And there are lots of benefits, tangible benefits, forecasting the weather, forecasting storms, monitoring hurricanes or cyclones, dealing with natural disasters, understanding global change, managing environmental security, all kinds of benefits to the operation of a modern society with the positioning, navigation, timing information that comes from Galileo and GLONASS and Beidou and GPS. These are usually things that government qualifies as a so-called public good and pays for. I'll come back at the end to this last question on this slide. You know, is this what governments are going to focus on in the 21st century? Using space to provide tangible benefits. or will that be paralleled with continued science and exploration? What will be the primary reason for governments being active in space? Let's go to the next slide. Clearly, one benefit for some societies in the process of social and economic development is the use of space systems for education, for healthcare, for communication, for resource location. Countries like Brazil, India, Indonesia, Nigeria, others with large territories and not very developed infrastructure in many cases can get real benefits from investing in space capabilities. Other countries, not as wealthy, not as large, can get similar benefits. Problem is that they probably can't afford them, and the space-faring countries to date have not given high priority to using space capabilities for social and economic development. The Outer Space does a lot of work. The United Nations Office of Outer Space does a lot of work in this area, but it doesn't have much resources. It's worth looking at what the Office of Outer Space Affairs does, and other global and regional organizations. And there's some discussion of the private sector providing capabilities like access to the internet, access to the web to poorer countries by these multi-satellite constellations that gets the private sector involved in development issues. Next slide. Commercialization. Governments should not be in the business of business. That's what the private sector exists for. But governments can help the private sector, and indeed have helped historically the private sector in developing commercial activities in space, creating, paying for research and development with the results being available to the private sector, creating shared infrastructure like launch pads, being an anchor tenant. SpaceX would not have survived to become a successful commercial business if the government had not been its first major customer. And that's true also with Ariane and Arianespace and other countries. Partnering with the private sector, that is the kind of au courant way for the government to get involved, and developing policy and regulatory regimes that help support the private sector. All of that are policy issues with the aim of facilitating space commercialization. Let's go to this next slide briefly. All right, this is something you've got to study to fully appreciate what all information is on this slide. It tries to measure the whole global space economy. You've perhaps heard about we're by 2030 or so going towards a $1 trillion space economy. We're already at $1/3 of $1 trillion. That's based on numbers like this. The numbers are a little slippery, and there's controversy over some of the numbers on this slide that I don't have time to go into. But look, governments on the upper left spend $80 billion on space, 80 out of 360. The rest of it is private spending, mainly on things like building satellites, launching them, and then in particular using them and all the equipment, the antennas, the ground equipment, the GPS systems to make it possible to employ space capabilities. And there's double counting and controversy on these numbers. So, but notice that government spending is about 1/4 of the total global space economy, at least by this measure. Next slide. The rise of the new private sector, both the multi-billionaire financed SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, the Breakthrough Foundation are spending a lot of private money in space, both because they have personal visions and because they see a market there. But there's been an exponential growth in smaller space companies and entrepreneurial companies that think that there is money to be made in space. Again, others will talk about that in subsequent lectures. My question is, all right, what does the government do? Does it partner with these new companies? Juan introduced me, talked about a man named Dan Hendrickson, a former student of mine who is with a company called Astro Robotics. That's a small company that the US government has partnered with to send a payload to the surface of the moon. How much of that is going to go on? Are there new regulations required that take into account all these new companies? What is the government's role? Is it only exploration? Will the private sector take over low Earth orbit, as some have suggested? And what's the success rate in the new space ventures? There are a lot of ideas, not a lot of success stories. Next question, next slide, or the next question. Some governments believe that we go to space because it fosters development of cutting edge technologies that will then benefit the broader economy of those countries, either by spin-offs or by pushing technology more quickly, innovation more quickly than it would advance otherwise. It's really hard to measure the impact of space activity on innovation and on the economy. There is a lot of controversy over how broad the economic benefits from space actually are. Next slide. A number of governments do things in space as a way of motivating technical excellence among their citizenry, with the idea that a technically literate citizenry is important to the 21st century well-being. The focus is on things that have come to be called STEM, or if you wish, STEAM, with art in there also. And the development of inexpensive launchers, of inexpensive satellites, make it possible for more people to do things in space. So, how do you evaluate the argument that space is an excellent motivator? Is it better than artificial intelligence, information technology, biotechnology? Is space still special in the 21st century? Next slide. Finally, is the question of why put humans in space? What are the rationales? What are the goals for human activity and presence beyond space, beyond the surface of the Earth? There is a utilitarian argument being tested, I guess, primarily on the International Space Station, that humans can be useful living and working in space, can carry out various activities more effectively than robots, and therefore bearing the risks and the costs of putting humans in space can be justified on a utilitarian basis. That's a very arguable proposition. To me, the space station has yet to demonstrate the payoffs from the activities carried out there. I mean, yes, it's a nice symbol of international cooperation, of working together, doing a difficult thing, but have there been benefits coming out of either social or economic benefits coming out of the space station that justify the cost of building and maintaining it? Argument we could take a long time with, but not now. What are the other arguments? I've listed some of them as reasons for putting humans in space. Most of them, I think, imply travel beyond Earth orbit, not just going in circular orbits around this planet. And we could discuss each of these rationales in detail. No time to do that. Next slide. What about exploration and settlement? That's what drives me to be interested in space. 51 years ago, I was at the Kennedy Space Center when Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins left for the moon. I watched them walk by me on their way to their booster and then on the way to the lunar surface. So I'm a lunatic. I think going into space beyond Earth orbit to explore, maybe eventually to settle, is the right reason for having humans in space. So this vision has motivated a lot of people, but we went to the moon for geopolitics on Earth, not because of exploration. And in the time since we left the moon in 1972, we have not gotten to the point of being willing to spend the money to go back. Now we have people like Musk and Bezos who have visions of people living and working on off of Earth. We'll see whether their private visions can be the way that humans leave. So I ask, will human exploration and settlement be an important part of the 21st century? If so, will it be government or private sector that leads it? Next slide. Bottom line question. So far, only 24 of us humans have traveled beyond Earth orbits, and 3 people made the trip twice. Only 12 walked on the moon. Will humans return? Reach Mars? Will we settle there or not? To me, those are the questions that are most interesting about space and space policy. But I realize these days that's a minority view. Final slide. What are the future government roles in space? Supporting only useful space activities, things that provide benefits to people here on Earth, and some degree of robotic science and exploration, but not human activity? Or will human exploration be accepted as an appropriate rationale for government sponsorship? I hope the answer is both, but you're the ones that will find out. Okay, that's the last slide. We're open for questions.
All right, thanks so much, John. It's a great talk. Definitely piqued the interest in policy and rationale. So we have a question from Mona. Mona Nasir.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the talk. It was really interesting to listen to and very interesting points. I had 2 questions. One was that everybody talks about transferring technological innovation from space program to Earth. But I've seen both in your talk and in your papers, you talk about some of the policy initiatives that happen with international collaboration like ISS and so on. And I wondered about your views about kind of transferring policy innovations from space collaboration to Earth. And my second question was, I was reading a lot about the scientific mission like New Horizons, the Mars mission, and how much politics along with scientific reasoning has driven this decision making. And I wonder how much this kind of change of the context of the Space Force and the military's position in that, do you think would affect the selection of the scientific missions that would be in the future happening? And yeah, so that's the 2 questions.
Okay, the first one's easier than the second one. It's very hard to separate out specific technological innovations of broad impact that have originated in space, because innovation is a kind of broad-based process, and it can be happening in non-space and space context at the same time. So things like mammograms, things like the detection instruments in mammograms are often related to the detectors in Hubble and similar space telescopes. It actually came out of the intelligence satellite program first. It's a little hard to do that. The one example, Tang and Velcro did not come out of the space program. Digital computing and miniaturization, but it was also happening in the military missile program at the same time it was happening in the space program. So there's no real, if you look at the literature on innovations coming from space that have had broad economic or social payoffs, you'll find it's a kind of shaky literature. And I'm not an economist, so let others more skilled in the economic arts than I try to answer that question. I was a little confused by the second question. You started out, I think, saying exploration, but then you talked about the Space Force. Can you repeat it in short form?
No, I meant like it seems like the choices of a lot of scientific missions have other factors beyond the scientific reasoning that affected it.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether the changing environment, it's only not only military, also the private sector and everything, how it would affect the kind of drivers that drive scientific missions.
Sure. Okay, I got it now. Well, when you spend public money, there's always going to be politics. And so, yes, there are political considerations of impact on particular legislative districts or political districts, impacts on firms. One firm competing with another will lobby for its program and winning a contract, and then kind of macro politics. It's still one example. A good example to right now is the so-called Artemis Accords. I don't know how many of you have heard of that, where the United States has set forward a set of principles for those countries that want to cooperate in our return to the moon program called Artemis. And so it's the United States trying to define the political policy context for a space activity. And clearly that's a political activity. So yes, as long as the space programs are carried out by governments, there will be politics.
All right. Thanks, Mona. Thanks, John. So we have about 6 minutes, so we'll get a few more questions in here. From Tamir in Japan.
Hi, John. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk about policy in space. I wanted to ask you in regards to Artemis and the rise of China's space program and economy. So I'm particularly interested in like the exploration of the moon and the setup of a permanent base, and then maybe follow up in Mars. So I was interested in like how big of a factor you think China has in the competition between like a US-led alliance and the Chinese-led one, particularly with news recently that I don't know how accurate, but that Russia does not want to join like a US-led alliance in Artemis. And I'm also curious about like how you see China's strength in space developing over the years, and like at what point they'll be competitive with the US.
Well,
thank you.
China is competitive with the United States. China's made a commitment years ago to develop comprehensive space capabilities, set out in public for its civilian program what its steps will be, and basically has done on the schedule it set out everything it has said it would do. And its next step in the next year or two is the development of a significantly sized space station. China says its plans call for humans going to the moon early in the 2030s. I see no reason to doubt that and think that they're racing to be further. So China's going at its own pace, not being driven by racing, by competition with the US for achievement, but for its own pace to become, and I think it already kind of has, a seat at the center table in space issues, in space policy. So and when is it? Tomorrow or Thursday? Thursday, I think, is the launch date for its Mars probe, which is a very ambitious Mars lander and rover. That will be a very impressive activity. The fact is that if China were to say it was going to send humans to the moon, it would probably have a mild impact on US activity, but only a mild impact. We I think, won the race to the moon in 1969. We don't need to rerun that race.
Thanks, Samir. So next question is from Nimesh Patel.
Yeah, hi, John. It was an interesting talk. My question is on policy for peaceful use of outer space. Actually, if some countries goes to some planet and if they claim that, okay, this is my planet, so is there any policy available internationally to regulate this?
Well, I mean, you will get a good discussion from Tanya Masson in a couple of days about the existing body of international law applying to space. And there is a general constitution, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which says that space is the common heritage of mankind. So there is a body of law and derived principles, I would say, that governs most people most of the time in their space activities. It is not a lawless environment. There is law that applies. It was written in 1960s, so updating that to recognize 21st century realities is, I think, a very interesting challenge.
Okay, so it looks like we got time for one more question, probably two. Let's see, from Jacopo.
Hello. So we're talking about policies and governments and private sector. Correct me if I'm wrong, but when United States went to the moon, they took a lot of risk. I mean, the policy, I thought, was about showing off their capability, of course, to the Russian and to the world. And then they chose to take risks. Then it seems to me that nowadays the space sector, it's really, really more complicated, more bureaucratic, and we are not allowed to take any risks. For example, in Europe, you have ECSS, which is the standardization for the companies, for the space companies that have a lot of rules. They have a lot of rules about how satellites have to be designed and the process they have to withstand. And it seems to me also that SpaceX, on the contrary, is the company that is kind of going over all this bureaucracy, all this system engineering, this heavy amount of security needed, and has taken risks and has also taken a lot of success. I mean, they've done something that I didn't think was possible in the current regulation. So my question is, do you think it's fine nowadays to reduce the amount of regulation, have a more, let's say, liberal policy, or should we get more control over those companies, the private companies that wants to access space and let's say change a bit the regulation by themselves?
That's a good question. You want to make because it's clear that private companies with their own money at risk are seemingly more willing to take technical risks than government programs these days. Certainly in the United States, failure in a government program carries with it a lot of negative consequences. So the goal for governments, in my view, should be to regulate private activity to protect third parties, protect the public interest, but allow the private sector companies to take whatever risks they choose to take, as long as they don't provide threats of physical or property damage to third parties. And so a fairly loose regulatory regime rather than a tight one, I think, to encourage risk taking is the right approach.
Thanks.
All right. So we are at time. But John, I'm just going to ask, do you want to take one more question? Or
yeah, one more is fine.
Okay. So Bruno?
You know, I'm in lockdown here, so I've got no place to go.
Just a reminder before Bruno asks this question, if any of you haven't had a chance to ask your questions, please, you can put them in the chat. And John, is it okay if we send it over to you and at your leisure send back a response to these questions?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay.
Can I pose my question?
Yes, please go ahead, Bruno. Yeah.
I was getting a unstable connection. John, sir, many thanks for your talk. Very inspiring and a privilege to hear. I was just curious about your views on multilateralism. I think the UN is celebrating 75 years and the Security Council is completely blocked. So what future is there for multilateralism in space and what role for the UN, especially if states draw back and allow public-private partnerships to go ahead more? What are your views on that? Many thanks.
Well, let me kind of sneak up on that. I mean, we have in the International Space Station a very good example of multilateral cooperation in developing and operating a space facility. And I think almost anyone who discusses human exploration in the future talks about it as being a cooperative undertaking. So I think, and certainly all the robotic missions have international participation. So the actual carrying out of space activities, I think, will be dominantly multilateral in the years to come. But that's not really your question, as I understand. It's really in the governance of space activities, how much national power versus multilateral activity through the United Nations system or other multilateral agreements or organizations. And I think that's a excellent and unanswered question for the 21st century is, can we develop not a world space agency or anything approaching that, but a set of understandings negotiated either inside or outside the UN framework that will govern things like space situational awareness, space traffic management, protecting the planets as we explore them. There's a lot of work to be done for international diplomacy related to 21st century space activity. And I hope some of you folks are among those that do that work. So good luck to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I was your student in '89, and I remember one of your statements. I'm not sure who the original author is, but you said to us, countries do not have friends, they have interests. Do you think companies are doing the same?
Well, sure. I mean, this is, I realize, a kind of capitalist United States view, which is that the essence of private sector activity is competition for advantage. Sometimes the best way to get advantage is cooperation. but there's always a kind of competitive underpinning to various activities. So yeah, I think companies have interest just as much as countries do.
John, we wish you could stay with us. Maybe the lockdown has an advantage. You will be able to answer more emails from us. Thanks so much, and please remain a member of the ISU family. So long, John. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you very much for joining us for the first public event series of the Interactive Space program. So coming up next is next Monday, as you now see on your screens, is our International Astronaut Panel. So if you want to watch our astronauts talking about space and pandemics on Earth, and maybe pandemics in space, tune in next Monday, 27th of July, 12:30 p.m. UTC. We wish to see you there. Stay safe.
Is there a list of what astronauts are going to be at the panel? Still here?